Let's talk about Apple Nano-Texture display now that they are available in a MacBook Pro. I'm ArtIsRight. I have a few thoughts on this. This option should be based on your workflow, what you do, and what you prefer. There are no right or wrong answers. However, if you're not sure, you've definitely come to the right place. So I have been doing color management and been a professional photographer for over 20 years, and I'll be leveraging my experiences to have this discussion. And even though this conversation may be tailored a little bit more towards pro photography, what I'm about to share can apply to other creative workflow and general computing. Lastly, you may disagree with me, and that's perfectly fine. Just please remember to be kind in the comments. And with that out of the way, I've done a video similar to this before, talking about matte versus glossy display. And the reason why I've done that is because I have direct experience with various customers or with various users who've used both glossy and matte display. And there are a variety of experiences between those two. And I want to make a clarification of it. But anyway, this video is going to be very similar to that, but even more relevant now because Apple have just literally announced their nano-texture display or their matte display in one of their most popular computers, their MacBook Pro. So what we're going to do are a few things. I'm going to first talk about the computers and the displays that I have behind me. This way you understand what you're looking at, what you're really comparing, and we're definitely going to be looking at more than just glossy versus nano-texture. We're going to be taking a look at some of the other ones too. I'll talk about the calibration result for all of these. Then I'll go into the calibration method. We'll talk about the display improvement in this generation M4 MacBook Pro. And there are quite a bit that you may not know about because it's not really being discussed that much, but it's important for color accuracy. I promise you on that one. And lastly, we'll talk about more of the qualities between matte versus nano texture. I'll do some demos this way. You can see some of the variation. All right, so let's start out by me sharing you one thing. So I am only showing you 16-inch MacBook Pros right now, and I want to say a few things that whether the SoC or the silicon inside your computer is, for example, the M4, M4 Pro, or M4 Max, they're going to be using the same display technology. They're just based on the generation. And also the size. Whether you have a 14 or 16-inch, they're generally using the same technology to scale up or down depending on the size that you have. So you're going to get very similar result with those other display too. Okay, my previous or former daily driver, M3 Max. So in this generation, it only came with glossy displays. So that's one of them. So this is this machine right here. This next one, this is the M4 Max, or the middle one. This one has a glossy display, and the one on the very far right, this is an M4 Max that's going to be my new daily driver that has the nano texture display option. Now, in addition to this, as I mentioned already, we're going to be looking at other matte display too. So a typical non-Apple matte display is going to be represented by BenQ PD3225U. And this is a matte panel, however, it still has some reflectant to it, right? And the way how they have approached, or the way other manufacturers approach panel coating, is very different than the way how Apple have done it. So Apple is now using a single sheet of glass on the glossy, and the way how they're achieving the nano texture is by etching the glass, not any coating or anything like that on the piece of glass. So you're looking at right now are pieces of glass. That means that it still will have some and retain some of the reflective property because it is still glass. Whereas on a third-party manufacturer, for that matter, they're actually using a coating either on a piece of plastic or on the LCD panel itself, and that results in the reflectant that's totally different. And I think it's important for us to really see that. And another one that I'll be showing, this is BenQ SW272U. This has BenQ newest nano matte panel coating, and the coating on this itself, it just makes it seem what you're viewing on the display, it looks like you're looking at a matte sheet of paper. Almost no reflection whatsoever, diffuse the light by even more than what the nano texture can do. But this is not a laptop display. I'm just using this as a reference, and we're not trying to compare whether one is better or not. I'm just pointing out these differences. Okay, so with those out of the way, let's talk about the calibration result. All right, so for this, I have used Calibrate Profiler to do this, and for this, I am using Calibrate Display plus HL, and like I said, Calibrate Profiler software. The two Calibrate devices that can fully go in and calibrate these Apple Liquid Retina XDR display, or what they call their mini LEDs, are the Display Pro HL and the Display Plus HL, which is the one that I am using. Either one of these devices will do the job just fine. Okay, let's take a look at the calibration result first. So the M3 Max generation, or the M3 generation for that matter, the average delta E for all the patches is 0.6. The max delta E for one of the patch is 3.3, right? Play suspenseful music. M4 generation, M4 Max glossy display. So, average delta E for all the patches, 0.5. It is 0.1 lower, so we're getting a slight improvement in terms of accuracy. But what about the max delta E? Well, this is 2.7 versus 3.3. So that is quite significantly lower. So we're definitely getting a better color accuracy from this generation. And there are reasons behind that we're definitely going to talk about. And lastly, I know that many of you are sitting on the edge of your seat right now because you're wondering how the nanotexture is going to do. So let's take a look. The average delta E for all the patches, 0.5, the exact same between nanotexture and the glossy panel. However, the maximum delta E for that one patch is 2.3 on a nanotexture versus 2.7 on a glossy. I know many of you are kind of probably surprised right now that this is showing a slightly more accurate color on a nanotexture than on a glossy one. But there are a couple reasons to this, and this does definitely make sense. I love this panel. Now let's talk about the calibration method. It is something that I've taught on my channel, and I'll be releasing an update on that soon. And I do kindly ask, if you are using my video to transcribe it into writing or anything like that, please do cite me as a source. I would greatly appreciate that. So what I have done is gone into system settings, display, and set a preset or create a preset for photography for my workflow, and I've set these display at 80 nit brightness. From there, what I have done is gone into fine-tune calibration and use Calibrators profiler to measure the white points on the display. And I would put in the white point that the program is reading, and then I would put in the reference white point D65 for sRGB, Adobe RGB, P3 color gamut. So I put those in. Once I've fine-tuned the display, I've gone in and run a full calibration, which yields the result that you're seeing right now. So it is a more lengthy process. That's why I'm actually doing video. I think that if you want to calibrate these display properly, you should probably go through this entire process. There are certain shortcuts you can make, and I'll do mention that in the videos too. All right, now with that out of the way, we have noticed something that is significant. There are definitely color improvement coming from the M3 generation to the M4 generation. You may be wondering what has really changed. So a couple of things have actually changed. From the look of it, they're pretty much similar. The panel itself, the display, the assembly itself looks very similar. However, in one of the layers for the LCD panel or the mini LED panel, what Apple have done is change it from a KSF phosphor in the M3 generation to a quantum dot technology. Now, when they move over to the quantum dot, and this is like a newer quantum dot technology that doesn't have like cadmium in there, so is environmentally friendly, we have gained a couple of things. There are slight color gamut increase, better color saturation overall, better color accuracy, and better motion performance. So what we're able to pretty much verifying this one is definitely better accuracy. So if you're thinking about getting the previous generation M3 computers or M3 Pro, M3 Max, whatever that may be, versus M4, this may be something that might tip you over that I think the M4 generation may be better because of these technological improvement in the display that we may not know about. And the color gamut overall did increase on these display or the color gamut coverage, but they're just really just marginal. Okay, now with that out of the way, let's kind of have fun with this glossy versus matte display. So a couple things that I do want to show you right now is that I am going to close all these out, and I have the same wallpaper showing on all of these. And the first thing that I want to do is point this towards my studio light so you can see some of the reflection on the display, and you're seeing that right now on these glossies. And by the way, between the M3 and the M4 generation glossy display, they're very similar. So what I'm going to do is just use two computers as a demo for this. Okay, so we're going to turn this towards the light. You can see how it's just really showing kind of the edge of light there. And I'll turn this one towards the light and angle this. And you can see how it's actually showing a little bit, but it's just more of kind of like just a light diffusion there. Now, if I do it for this panel, let's pull this out to the side a little bit. This is BenQ PD3225U. This will be your typical matted panel from other manufacturers. You can see how it's reflecting. And you may say that, oh, hey, this is really reflecting a lot more of that white and is blocking everything out. It's not really that bad, but it's definitely going to show the reflection very different than the way how piece of glass would, right? So this is good for us to see the difference between those two. This is also glass, as I mentioned, nano-texture display, and you can see some of the reflection there. And lastly, we're going to do the same thing to this panel. And you can see the way how these are all reflecting, but they're all slightly different. So this is a diffuse light source. This is what it looks like. Now, here are my thoughts on Glossy compared to a nano-texture display. Let's start out with Glossy. This has been the standard for Apple laptop, regardless if it's the Pro and Air or just the MacBook for that matter, for the past 16 years. And interestingly enough, it is one of Apple's most popular computers, right? They sell so many laptops. Now, what Apple really wants to do is give the users, especially consumers, the best experience possible. So they want anything that users are viewing on the display to just jump and pop right out of the screen. Now, for creative pros, we have to run with some compromises for a very long time because these glossy displays does a few things. Our human vision have a tendency to view these and see whatever creative work on these glossy display as having the perception of being sharper, more contrast, more saturation. However, some of us got so used to this, right? Because it's been around for the past 16 years that we may not think about it much, but these contrasts, these saturation increases have a tendency to not really show us the truth about our edit. And many users are now finding this out, and I have helped many users in this regard because many have edited on a glossy display and they would get a display at home, whether it would be something like another third-party display, another Apple display with nano-texture, or for example, a hardware calibrated display, especially if you're a photographer. And they would take their edit, what they have done on these glossy panels, or on their iMac for that matter, and view it on these matted panels, and they would just reach out to me and say, hey, it doesn't look as good. What is really going on? I spend a lot of money on these external displays. I expect them to look great. So many of these users have sent me some of their files for me to help them edit and enhance, and pretty much I've done that, send it back to them and show them. And now what they're able to see is the fact that if you edit and get your image to look great on a matted panel, it also looks good on a glossy panel. However, the other way around cannot be said, meaning that if an image looks good on a glossy panel, it may or may not look good on a matted panel. So what's really going on here? Well, a couple of things. These glossy displays are not really showing you a truthful and honest assessment of what you're really working on because you're seeing more contrast and saturation. So what happens then, especially if you are a beginner or if you're an intermediate editor, you would have a tendency to take your work only about 50, 60, maybe 70% of the way there, and you would stop. Now you may be wondering, why did that stop happen? Why did they not take the edit further? That's because they start to do it before and after, right? The after looks much better than the before version on a glossy panel, and why go further? Why push the edit any further? That ends up becoming a lot of problem for creative pros that I have seen working on a glossy panel, whereas on any other matted panel or on a nano-texture display, what they would do is see that their work is really not quite there yet, and they will push it even further. And once they push that further, you're now getting to that into that 80, 90 to 100% where you really want to get your work to be. And once you get to that point, looking great on these matted display, it will look great on any other display. Because one great thing about these matted display options is that it's not really showing you a lot of bias in terms of color. It's just showing you truthfully and honestly what you're really getting and what your editing is really, like at that given point in time. And I think that's one crucial importance that a lot of people miss when they're having this conversation about, should I choose glossy? Should I choose the matted option? And let me also say that Apple is now also charging us $150 extra to get the nano-texture option. However, personally, as a creative pro, I would say that that is, definitely worth the money that you're going to spend on it. Because right now, just looking at this display, I can see the reflection in this environment. And yeah, the screen is not directly reflecting a light, but I can also see part of a tabletop there. Whereas I'm not seeing any of those on these other matted panels, the nano-texture and the other panels that I'm showing right now. So reflection is also going to be a huge deal. Now you may say that, oh, I'm always working or editing in a fully lighting control environment, and that may be true. However, let me also mention this to you because I've run into this myself a few times where If you have a white canvas or you're opening a web page that shows a lot of white, it is now shining that light on you, and you are now being reflected back on the display, and you can see your reflection in there. Whereas on these panels that I've been testing and using, you really can't see that. So that's one huge factor between the matte versus a nano texture display option. And what we're gonna do now is have a little bit fun. So I'm gonna reset up Studio a little bit before I wrap everything up. We're gonna zoom in on this, and I'm gonna shine a few lights on these display. This way you can see some of the variation between all these, and I think that's gonna be fun. So give me a moment, I'll reset and I'll come back. All right, I'm back, and what I'm gonna do for this is just stand on the side, but we're gonna do a couple things. So I'm gonna show you a few different light sources. What I'm gonna do first is use a light bar here that has a diffusion in the front, and we're gonna just pretty much turn that on. So this is pretty much just a white light bar like here. This is pretty much fully diffused. And if I take a look and show you this on display, you can see how the light bar is pretty much just reflecting on this glossy panel right there, right? The full one. Now let's take a look at the Nano-Texture display. So on the Nano-Texture display, I can try to even show you that. Let's come from a different angle here. You can see some of the highlights, but you're not really seeing the light being reflected as much. This is on the BenQ nano matted panel. You can see how it's just diffusing the light there. And lastly, these would be your typical matted panel, which are a little bit more reflective, but they're not really showing you the shape of light quite as much as the glossy panel, where comparing these two, you can see that one of them looks really sharp, right, on the glossy panel versus the matted panel. And you can see some of the variation between these two as well, whereas you can see clearly the light being reflected on the display there on the glossy one, and on the nano texture, you're not really seeing that much. You are seeing a little bit, but not too much at all, and you can see that. This is pretty much the way how this looks. Now, what happens if we put in a light source that is more specular in nature? So what I'm gonna do is put a flashlight here. So this is pretty much just an LED flashlight, you can kind of see, but this has no diffusion right in front of the LED itself, and then you can kind of see that. And when we point this towards the screen, you can, at certain angles, right, see there? You can pretty much see the light source itself being reflected. And I'm going to move it around a little bit on the glossy panel. This way you get a chance to see this showing on the screen. Now we do this on a nano texture one. You can see that it's showing just that diffuse light. It's not really showing this clear like source that is just, you know, extremely bright. I can move this around in multiple different directions. However, it is still that diffuse light. Similarly, this is on your typical matted panel from other display manufacturers. You can see that it's kind of a little bit more glossy in a way, even though this is matted and not as reflective. And lastly, if we do this on the nano matted panel, you can see pretty much the light coming out as diffused right there, but I mean, there's still just one spot that you can see, but you can't really see the light source. So for this last demo, I'll be using a handheld camera along with my iPhone flashlight, because this is a very small singular point LED light, and I think that's pretty good. We're gonna start out with the 16-inch MacBook Pro, and for this, what I'm gonna do is point this towards the screen and bring my iPhone in. So the iPhone is pretty much just hovering onto the side there, and you can see how this is pretty much reflecting a lot of the light itself. You can see the light source on the screen, even though that's actually overexposed right now. And as I'm moving this up and down, you can see exactly the shape of this light. So this is the one thing about a glossy display to be aware of. Now let's move over to the nano texture. You can see that on the nano texture, it's diffusing that light a lot more. And to the human vision right now, I'm not really seeing the flare coming from the light as much. And the color overall that I'm getting from the display is still looking really good. Although, because both of these laptop screens, they're still glass, you can see the variation between the two right there. We're still seeing a lot of the reflections. I mentioned this before, that because they're glass, they still retain certain reflective properties. Now, let's take a look at your typical non-Apple matted display panel. So when we take a look at this, this is based on a coating. You can see that, you know, it is diffusing a light and it's not really showing as much. Now, what I can still see right now is a light source, so it still is somewhat defined. And this is what you're going to get with most other matted displays that are on the market. So somewhat similar, but a little bit more diffused in a way than the nano texture display. And lastly, we're going to bring this to BenQ Nano Matte panel. For the Nano Matte panel, you can see that I can't even see the light source. This is doing a really good job diffusing this. So this is just giving us a reference between all these four and the way how they are reflecting very differently this specular light source. So let's go back down to the nano texture display. You can see how it's still somewhat reflecting there. It still shows the light source, but much less reflective compared to the glossy display option. So hopefully you're able to see the reflection using the different light source that I have demoed. Now, I try my best to show you this. However, sometimes trying to capture these on camera can be difficult. And if you're ever in a situation where you can do the comparison yourself, you have the same tool I do. You have your phone with you. Simply take it out, turn that flashlight on. This is a small specular light, and you can see the reflection right away and the different properties for these display panel. I think that's one of the most powerful tools that you have. So some have also asked me regarding the nano texture display versus glossy, what about the sharpness? I mean, when I'm really doing my work and doing my edit, they are about the same. In general though, they're all based on a human vision. And one thing I can say right now is on these matted type panels, it's very similar to applying a very slight diffusion layer over what you're doing. It doesn't really deter or detract per se for what I do, and I don't really think much about that at all. But if you're really as concerned about that, you want them crisp as sharp as possible, yeah, this would be the one. But again, I'm still seeing the reflection of my camera on the display, where on these other ones, I really can't see that much. On this one, a non-third party matted display, this is not using the latest matted technology. I can still see some of the reflection as my hands moving around, but not as much compared to this glossy one where I can pretty much see everything. So yeah, that's my perspective on the glossy compared to the nano texture. I think that for a Creator Pro, it's one of those things that is really worth it. It will enable you to edit in more environments with less distraction coming in. I mean, I know is one thing that when I'm editing or doing work on an airplane and I have this up, if the windows are open, forget about it. I have to turn the laptop to the left or to the right to avoid like stray light coming in. In a coffee shop, I have to do the same thing, find a corner. I can do less of that now and I can work in more environments. So just something to note about those. Oh, and one more thing that I forgot to mention is that these new M4 generations, you can now bring the display max brightness up to 1000 nits compared to 600 in the M3 generation and 500 in the M2 and M1 generation MacBook Pro. So a lot of interesting things happening there. Anyway, I hope you find this helpful. If you have any questions or comments, do share them with me. Give this a like, subscribe, and hit the bell if you're new. I'm Art, and I thank you for your time.